welcome back. I'm so glad to have the opportunity to talk to you about the final topic, which is reentry recovery and kind of looking into the future. So we're kind of at the end of our cycle here when we're talking about the disaster cascade and disaster cycle. Yep, still not advancing it correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and close these boxes so I don't get distracted. So what we're going to start off talking about are kind of some definitions around this particular part of the cycle. And we're going to start that conversation with talking about damages so we can kind of get a context of what we're talking about as we move further ahead, especially as it relates to practitioners. Hello to everyone who just joined. So we're just starting the session. And so I wanted to start with talking about indirect damages and the difference between other sorts of damages incurred in disaster settings. And again, we're talking about the final part of the cycle, which is reentry and recovery. So indirect damages, losses and casualties can occur months or years after the storm. We're going to come back to this, but this is something that's really important to know because it's going to frame our conversation. And it's probably going to be something that is very familiar to you because within the past 2 years, this has been a big part of conversation when talking about law and specifically disaster response. This has especially been something FEMA has been kind of under fire for, especially with estimates around mortality and other kind of effects specifically secondary to Hurricane Maria. So we'll take a look at that as well. And what we want to know mainly about indirect damages is that many of these losses are incurred due to premature re-entry post-event. So this is also going to relate later to like why do we as practitioners need to really understand the nuances of, you know, the damages incurred by disaster. And these really aren't well understood or fully calculated well into recovery. This can be decades. So this is why over time you might see specifically death tolls change so much because it is really hard to calculate these things on the ground. And what we're going to be talking about is, you know, how can we mitigate the kind of damages that are incalculable and sometimes unseen and within our blind spots as practitioners during the recovery phase. And this is pretty much what I was just saying. So how do we prepare ourselves for the reentry of ourselves, our agencies, and our clients? And what can we do to recover while mitigating all of those indirect losses as well as direct? I'm going to get into that in a moment. So I really enjoyed this picture on the right. This is a commonly used picture specifically, or like a graph when we're talking about disaster, conflict, war. It's applicable to any sort of crisis or event that leads to damages or is expected to lead to damages or deaths or casualties. Indirect losses, again, are losses and casualties and damages that occur after an event or a storm has already occurred. Again, really hard to calculate, sometimes hard to understand, and they tend to evolve over time and are extremely, extremely contextual. In some contexts, it might be, you know, looking at food insecurity, secondary to the collapse of infrastructure in a given context, you know, related to ongoing war. A good example to look at when we're talking about indirect losses would be something like the Ebola crisis in West Africa. There were, you know, many deaths related to the outbreak itself, but when you look at indirect loss, there was a great impact on an economy, on job security, and I think this is well understood and kind of ubiquitous throughout all disaster contexts, but they hit with different severities across different contexts. And if you are interested in looking at, you know, a context that has not yet been fully understood until recently, the Ebola context is a very good one. Huge disruption of supply chains, huge disruption of economic stability. Then we have, you know, we're talking about like this reentry stage and specifically, you know, how this works around it. We define this specifically as the period by which civilians and businesses begin to return, but there's no particular time frame that is usually officially defined, allotted, or declared. what we understand, especially Louisiana as a state that has experienced several disasters and several reentries, regardless of the severity, is that, you know, uh, people are going to reenter as they will. There are definitely ways to mitigate kind of the damages that are incurred by early reentry. And, this is usually education, communication practices, but there are individuals, populations, and communities that are going to re-enter a post-disaster context, regardless of whether it's safe or appropriate. And there's many reasons for that. That might be needing to get to your home, needing to get to resources that are in your community or your home. That might be getting to loved ones that were left behind. People have been known to re-enter early to find their animals. So reentry is a really tough topic, and it is an area in disaster that there's a lot of research going into to try to understand how do we mitigate the damages that occur from reentry. And often these damages look like needless deaths. I mean, all deaths in these contexts are needless, but sometimes people are putting themselves at risk, and there's always the risk of death in that particular context. And then we're also talking about, the recovery period. So these are multi-stage efforts to return to normalcy. This word is falling out of fashion in the disaster world because there's an understanding, we talked about this last week a little bit, but there's an understanding that the word normal does not necessarily suit a particular context. People tend to shy away from normal. Some find it very offensive, especially when you're saying, we're just trying to get the community back to normal. The term bounce back to has received a lot of attention as being a more negative sort of connotation, because you're really seeking to, move forward and not necessarily just, go back to a certain level of infrastructure, a certain level of society, because maybe that society wasn't, or that infrastructure actually wasn't appropriate, or it wasn't good. Maybe normal wasn't good. So there's a lot of talk about, is normalcy what we're really striving for? But that's, I think, the kind of deeper investigation into the linguistics around disaster. So again, this is the chart that was just on the last page. This is a look at, what is direct, what are direct damages, what are indirect damages, and then there's what's quantifiable and what's not quantifiable. The quantifiable direct is everyone's favorite thing to really look at post-disaster. These are the things that we have numbers for. This is quantitative measure. This is what a lot of research is done on, and this is the information that most readily comes out of a disaster context. Now, it's not always correct, and that's often because these research methodologies are under a lot of strain in disaster settings, and there's sensationalism, sometimes there's biased reporting, but when we're talking about direct quantifiable damages, these are things that we can really put into either like some kind of numerical value, or it's quantifiable monetarily. Again, this is like property damage, things like deaths, injuries. Not always accurate, but you can assign a number to it. Then you have the direct non-quantifiables. This is, the example given here is destruction of a site of cultural significance. These are direct damages in which you can say with confidence that something has been lost, but you're not quite sure what the effect of that loss is going to be. I do like the example they're using because it's very difficult to estimate what the impact of a loss of something like a cultural site would be. There's a lot of discussion around that regarding Katrina, the loss of kind of a cultural epicenter and pieces of that cultural epicenter. This was actually a really big deal in the 2012 floods of Vermont, in which they lost a lot of their covered bridges. Now, there was a quantifiable direct number assigned to the loss of those bridges. That, it cost money to fix the roads, to reorganize the roads. But those bridges had been there since the 1800s, and people are still grieving. So it's hard to estimate the value of that loss when it's not easy to quantify. On the lower end, we have these really difficult sorts of subjects, and often these get lost in conversation. And these are not well ingrained in the disaster management field. These are the indirect quantifiables and the non-quantifiable indirects. These are things people don't like to talk about because often there's no baseline to really understand the worth of some of these things. Katrina is another good example. The educational system has never been thoroughly reviewed pre-Katrina. So, after its loss, it was really difficult to understand quantifiably the worth of it before the event and after the event, because that is still an evolving situation. So this is something that is both, or if we're talking about non-quantifiable and indirect, this is something that is difficult to assign value to and is an indirect loss. On the other side, there's the more quantifiable indirects. This is, vague estimations. These are usually those really wide parameters you see where, a business might say we're losing anywhere between 50,000 a year and $1 million. That's a huge range. I'm not an economic person. I'm not well versed in economics, so it's probably a ridiculous range of money to not know about. But this is an area that is deeply important, but not always well understood because it comes from an apparent interruption in services, in things produced by the area, but it's also an indirect damage where you're not really sure if the damage will occur at all. And it's very important, it's especially because of the monetary value. So I do think that this is a good way to kind of present recovery, because when disaster managers, when this field comes together to talk about where are we going next, this is what they try to understand before they move forward. And for the most part, you're operating on a very large blind spot. And most of the work is going to be in this direct sort of alignment. Most people pay attention there. Or if there's direct monetary value, that's where a lot of the attention goes. And I'm sure you've noticed that. So this is what I was mentioning before. A great article came out last year. I made this deck last year, just after Maria. And there was this huge article that came out. I mean, it's right here. It was, how did Puerto Rico's death toll go from 64 to 2975 in Hurricane Maria? This is exactly what we're talking about. These are those damages these are indirect losses. These are damages that you cannot predict. So these are not damages that are directly related to event deaths. These are damages that occurred due to non-potable water, illness, an epidemic, lack of heating. So this is similar to illness, but heat exhaustion, and then failed infrastructure. These are deaths that were not counted within the event, but are related to the event. The problem is often the larger end of this scale, the true number, is not honored in a lot of spaces because they say, hey, this didn't happen because of the hurricane. This happened because, the country didn't have good water. And that's not always, in the eyes of especially a lot of policymakers, a corollary. And that's a really important thing to understand about recovery, is that there are going to be a lot of damages and indirect loss that may not be subject to law or reimbursement. And that's something clients always need to know, and us as practitioners need to know. I looked at the number yesterday, and it had not moved a lot since 2018. It just climbed over 3,000. This might look familiar. We looked at this last week. The recovery process we alluded to, but I think we spent a lot of time last week on impact, the honeymoon, and like the disillusionment area of this map. And this is, there's like so many versions of this. This is another version. I think we had 2 other versions in the last slide deck. But the reconstruction phase is really what we're talking about, as well as a little bit of this like disillusionment period. But this is when you start to acknowledge those indirect losses and start building tradition and anniversary behavior, and really start to emotionally. I think the thing that we need to understand about this period is where a lot of emotional healing or triggering, oh, no problem, triggering occurs. And this is SAMHSA's version, so this is very oriented towards mental health. So they're looking at working through grief, they're looking at individual and community setbacks, as well as agencies go through this just like individuals and communities do. And it's supposed to be an upward arcing recovery. That is the ideal, but we know that that's not necessarily the exact picture of what happens in a post-disaster context. Some communities don't return. A good example of a community that struggles with that kind of recovery period because of the inability to return are often communities that have suffered from radiological disaster. So you can find a lot of information about the post-Pripyat Chernobyl communities and the post-Fukushima communities, Fukushima, Japan. These communities, this chart looks very different because reconstruction no longer takes place at the site of the event. The mourning does not take place at the site of the event. So I highly recommend doing your own research kind of on how do you move forward when the land or the place in which all these memories are attached is completely gone and it's almost impossible to commemorate. And these places aren't completely gone, but they're not accessible. This is actually an area of interest in Louisiana because of land loss. And researchers are starting to say, hey, we're going to be losing land to natural disaster and man-made disaster. How are we going to help people grieve and mourn something that will literally no longer be there? It's a really interesting part of ongoing recovery. So what we know as practitioners, and kind of these are just some really important guidelines just to keep in your head when we're talking about reentry and recovery. These are just like 4 kind of like golden topics that don't really change regardless of the context. One thing that we know, and we talked about this in week 1 and 2, is that different orders cause delays. This is really about communication. It depends on jurisdiction. It depends on how communities are reacting. Some communities self-mobilize and make, almost create government amongst themselves in times of crisis, and those jurisdictions may not agree with each other. So there's often a struggle for command. This was, again, very apparent during Katrina. Huge struggle of command between different jurisdictions, which led to a delayed response. And this is definitely something that is extremely avoidable. So this is, when people talk about a disaster being a man-made disaster despite a natural disaster event, this is often where that went wrong. It's about fighting for jurisdiction and not having the resources and infrastructure to manage the event itself. Again, differing messages cause confusion. We talked a lot about communication and, how do we ensure that everything we're saying is valid and confirmed and is not going to do, do more harm than good. Really important part of the re-entry phase, because you don't want to give people the wrong idea about what they're re-entering into. Things have changed a lot over the past decades. Re-entry used to look really differently across the past decades. 2005 is very different than 2019. A lot more access to technology, a lot more ways in which communications disseminate. Social media was not where it was in 2005. 2005 didn't look anything like the 80s. So things are evolving. Communication is done differently, and that still means people are going to be affected in different ways. Some people don't have access to the level of these technologies. Some people are still very isolated, don't quite know what's going on. So they might be getting different messages in their community while, the news is saying this, and then, something is happening on my handheld radio and I'm hearing this. So as agencies, what we can at least do is control our message. Bad conditions can fuel cohesion or conflict. This is probably the media's favorite thing to focus on besides the crisis itself. But these are those stories of social brotherhood, communities flourishing in disasters, communities responding. This is often that period that you see on TV where people are doing on the ground grunt work and rebuilding themselves. But that can also go the other way. In some post-disaster communities, there's, a fracturing of the identity of that community. There's endangerment, there's violence. It really depends on the cultural context, as well as the social resources, the infrastructural stability, and whether there is, especially when we're talking about conflict abroad, disaster abroad, if that area is in a state of stress before the disaster. Well, excuse the horns. And then finally, a later return is a safe return. The longer you can wait, the better. Some people can't wait to open their business. One thing that we can do as agencies is really guide people through kind of, what if I return now? What happens then? Are there resources? How do I expect to move forward? It's really good to kind of do that talking through therapy, because some people are so eager to return and resume normalcy, or achieve a new version of normalcy for themselves, that they're not thinking through the challenges of an environment like this. So I think a rule of thumb that we utilize in the field is that the later you can return, and again, there's a lot of financial barriers to this, the safer it is for you, your business, your community, to really move forward into the recovery period. So the return recovery period is just as critical and sensitive as the event itself. In the disaster management field, we often think that this is probably the most critical period. The event itself is extremely critical because you're trying to mitigate damages that will move forward into the future. But the return and recovery is a lot about social health, mental health. It's these really nebulous parts of the post-disaster environment or the disaster environment that are harder to tackle but make the largest impacts. It's hard to think during a disaster about, how are people going to move forward mentally from this? So the return phase kind of embodies that. There's going to be a lot of adjusting. Things are going to look different. They're going to feel different. Some people or businesses, communities may never return or may never, look the same. So this period is very critical in the health and well-being of a community in general in the post-disaster context. So we're going to look at some information and some tools. I am sure you have seen something like this before. This is something you can apply for every year, regardless of whether an event has really occurred. What you pretty much do is you register, make it known that you are an existing entity, and then you register for reentry. So it's good to communicate again with NOLA.gov or with Homeland, like we were talking about last week, and say, hey, I'm a business or I'm an agency. I do this. I anticipate us, returning, assuming that there is viability to the area and the land, and it's safe to return. And as soon as you give us the go, we intend to return. And that kind of sets up an understanding from the legal side that you will be returning, and they can anticipate your return. Really good to just introduce yourself to someone over there, so they know who you are and what you're doing, which I'm sure actually you probably already are doing. So Ready NOLA issues these reentry placards to businesses and agencies, and all of this is dependent on what you're doing. This will give you something called a tier level. I know that it says right here, tier 1 is often given to people who will be doing assessments and really understanding the damages incurred. And then moving into tier 2, this would be someone like the Red Cross, though they're more likely to have been part of the actual events, so they might not actually have to go through this, but Habitat might be an example of an agency that can be considered a tier 2 because you'd be actively involved in recovery if that's part of your mission and interest. And then tier 3 are those things that keep the community sustained and alive. These are your businesses and your restaurants. These are actually quite reasonable. The process is very reasonable, and these are quite easy to obtain, especially when you have that pre-established relationship. So I really recommend, sometime in the near future, making that relationship with someone over at Homeland. This is what the placard looks like. It's just a piece of paper. I have one of these, and you just put it right on your dashboard. It gives you your designation, what you are. It'll say that you can either re-enter, so you'll have R, or no re-entry. I'm not really sure what the context would be of them giving you a re-entry authorization with no re-entry, unless something catastrophic had happened and they were zoning the city. But it seems really unusual that they would give somebody that. The logos in the bottom are the parishes covered. So you, as a re-entry authorized entity or individual, are allowed to enter any of these parishes as designated on your little placard. You can come and go as you please and do your work and check in. It's actually a very, very powerful tool, and it lasts at least a year. They really hope that it doesn't have to go beyond a year. That's why they do a year. And then finally, they give you a permit number. This is something that you should really keep on file, especially when you're in communication with the city and any local governance. Good to have it also for when you're entering these checkpoint areas. So we were talking a little bit about like evacuation and contraflow, and getting people back in is just as complicated as getting them out. It's often more stressful than the actual evacuation period, because there are actually more unknowns during the reentry period, because a lot of, I mean, things are changing again with technology and the rigor of surveying, but often when people are in reentry stage, they don't have a lot of information. There's a lot of rumors that go around, a lot of misinformation, and sometimes things change, especially if you're talking about flooding. Water levels change. More flooding can actually occur secondary to other events after the event itself. So it can be very easy to kind of confuse your risk and not actually appropriately assess your risk. And like we were saying, this is not well communicated for the most part, even though it's one of the most sensitive periods of recovery. And you can expect and also allow clients and other people to know that this is a long process. Reentry is a long process. And again, since it's city and state specific, there might be requirements that you cannot actually meet, and you might not know this until you get there. They really shouldn't be doing things like ID checks, but you never know what a state or a city populace is going to ask of you when you re-enter. So it's really good to advise people to just have every, proof of address, license. If there's an entry placard, have that with them. But it's a complicated, long process for the most part. So the first toolkit we're going to look at is actually produced by FEMA. We mentioned in week 1 that Louisiana had a FEMA designation and a FEMA area. It's 6, which is very interesting because it's not really lumped together with the states that have similar disaster risks and threats. It's grouped together with New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. And again, what's interesting about this is that these states, except maybe Texas, maybe Arkansas a little bit, these states don't share a strong relationship when it comes to what sort of disaster experts would be required and what kind of response would be anticipated. The Gulf Coast, no question, very similar. So that coast of Texas, coast of Louisiana. But when it comes to risk assessment and needs, it is more similar to the adjacent group, which includes, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, those guys down there. So I always found that interesting. So this tool, FEMA, honestly, the list is endless. If you want to, over the next week, become an expert in the management of livestock and floods, there's a course for that. There's a course for, managing radiological disasters, managing flooding disasters. They really are probably the #1 producers of education around disaster management. They also have an academy. That's for people who really want to become more serious. This is something that you can have in conjunction with your own personal practice. It's not quite at the level of it's kind of like an associate's degree, but it makes you a certified disaster manager, um, who can also be deployed should you ever seek employment with FEMA. So FEMA.gov is where all this is located. They have specialized toolkits. They had one for Sandy, which is very applicable to the Louisiana context. So I recommend looking into the specific information around Sandy. Again, New York, New Jersey, deeply resourced, very different context, but the recommendations are very worthwhile for anyone living in a coastal zone. And this is for agencies. We talked a lot about what can we give individuals, where we know what can we print out to give them, where can we steer them, what radio channels, what apps should they be looking at. But this is predominantly for agencies, unless a specific client is deeply interested in studying livestock disasters and things like that. They're very good classes. I've taken quite a few. So these are the main goals of this toolkit. It wants to support and build the recovery capacities and community planning resources of local, state, and tribal governments. They have a lot of resources for how to assess your program and understand your capacity to be part of the community planning phase upon reentry. I mean, again, they're quite good at what they do when it comes to developing materials. They support agencies in guiding you through the FEMA processes. You can actually request specialized training, and they gear it towards your specific agency and what you need from them, specifically within the context that you're working within, and will also help you understand, what can I do for my clients and how can I prepare them to interact with FEMA in the future. No one wants to interact with FEMA as an individual. It's a tough process. It's luckily in place. We're very fortunate to have something in place, but I think all individuals understand that they rather come home to a stabilized situation than have to work with FEMA, but FEMA can walk you through, what will a client expect. And things have changed a lot in the last decade or two with FEMA. And they work a lot on educating agencies, like I was saying before. They do specialized interactions, should you be interested. And they provide documents specifically related to the FEMA recovery processes, as they should. So they have one particular toolkit called the FEMA Community Recovery Management Toolkit. This is a rather new collection of materials. I believe this was developed in the last 2 years. This deck was built shortly after it was released. The link is here. It's very easy to find. So if you don't remember this link or can't take it down, like FEMA.gov, and it's like right there. It's called the National Disaster Recovery Framework. And it splits it into 3 predominant sections, and then with, specific trainings, because it knows that like maybe you have a different context than the broad stroke. And they split it into organization, planning, and management. So the key resources are always listed on each page. They really do walk you through, how can I interact with my community? How can I assess my community? But also, how can I interact with FEMA? They understood that in the last decade and a half, their performance has not been publicly appreciated. FEMA, for as much as, there are complaints about its operations, they did understand that there was a problem. So they went about and created this community recovery management toolkit, and it is kind of a way to introduce people to the idea of FEMA. So one of the things listed on here is the procurement toolbox. I highly recommend that you take a look at this. It's very useful for moving forward, especially if you plan on being a support system in the recovery period. So I'm just going to break down quickly what all these things are. It's very self-explanatory, but it's so much information that sometimes you get lost in there. And really the way I would go about it is kind of deciding, which area are we really lacking in, if there's an area like that at all, and then kind of digging into those materials, because they're also supportive. You might be a very organized agency. You might be an organized individual and feel like you don't need to necessarily better understand how to engage your stakeholders or understand who you should be liaising with. But the organization part of this toolkit focuses specifically on that. How do we engage the community before, during, and after these events? What does leadership look like in your community? How can you collect resources to understand how the community is organized? Sorry if you can hear that, that's my dog in the background sleeping. And then this also helps you coordinate stakeholders. It's a really good resource. It's actually really impressive. It kind of walks you through, like, how do I analyze the relationships that we have and how can we all benefit each other, and disseminate the appropriate information and respond appropriately so that we're also part of mitigating damages. The planning, this is actually a really substantial tool, and it's kind of exhausting to utilize. But if you have someone in your agency that loves to really monitor and evaluate what you're doing, this is an excellent thing to be doing. This helps you create a disaster recovery plan for your agency and immediate community and all the satellite agencies you might be working with. Every agency should have a plan. They're usually kept in the office of some poor person in a corner office with no windows. No one reads this thing often, but it's usually a very thoroughly done plan that recognizes every possible risk, every possible situation, and says, this as an organization is what we're going to do. There has to be a lot of collaborative leadership around the development of this, but FEMA walks you through it. And I think this is actually one of the most important things that this toolkit offers, because it has made accessible something that previously has not been accessible. Usually disaster planning or disaster plans, especially agency disaster plans, are something you would hire a consultant for. And this has made it accessible to agencies to do themselves, because sometimes a consultant cannot get the sense of what your community or your agency needs in the event of a disaster. Some aren't familiar with the context of the disaster that you're anticipating. So I highly recommend looking at that. And, if I were to give anyone homework, developing a disaster recovery plan is the thing. A lot of big agencies have them. I'm sure Habitat for Humanity has them, but there's a lot of small agencies and even like local community nonprofits that don't have a plan and could really benefit from one. So the management piece, this really assists you in understanding how to manage staff and financing, with a heavy emphasis on financing. This is another big blind spot, and that's really because a lot of this is extremely overwhelming. They really walk you through how to financially prepare, but also how to keep record of what you're doing and how to apply for grants. There's a lot of grants that they list on the website, and I highly recommend looking at those grants. But this is another challenging aspect that is extremely useful. And then again, they have like a topic specific area. This, it constantly changes and fluctuates depending on need. FEMA has become very responsive in developing materials. Again, like they've recognized that people have no idea how FEMA works, but people are always interacting with FEMA. I haven't looked up the number, I wish I had this morning, of how many disasters have been declared this year. I know I mentioned the number, but I'm sure it has changed since 4 weeks ago. But they have a lot to manage, and they realize that all of these people, they're crashing the website, they're trying to utilize old information. This is in direct response to that issue. So it's good to keep up with the topic specific frameworks, because they're always reanalyzing the needs of individuals in the post-disaster setting. And those are some examples of the sections that they've added. There we go. Another thing to be aware of is disasterassistance.gov. So, everyone knows what FEMA is. They know what the purpose of FEMA is. It's a big bank, essentially, that does do soft response, but it's essentially a way to financially manage disaster for the country. But all claims, this is just, a big tip for all the agencies, All claims are actually processed through disasterassistance.gov. So many people get lost in the FEMA hole, especially just laymen, people trying to say, hey, like, I need someone to help me file this claim on my house. They end up at FEMA and they can't find it. That's because it is actually located here. Once you're on this website, it's a pretty easy tool to use. It's even good to do a kind of a dry run. I always recommend people to go here, do a dry run, see what's going on, see if there are any disasters, see if there's any information. You'd be surprised sometimes that there's assistance that can be claimed and people have no idea that they were eligible. So the big thing to take away is that recovery is about process, not product. So many agencies and individuals, very well-meaning individuals, are very focused on product. What can I give? Recovery is a lot about process and creating the right infrastructure to move forward upon. Product is great. It's great to receive donations. It's great to try out, within reason, new technologies in context that disaster creates. A lot of housing sort of projects have come out of disaster context for good and bad, but those are products. The recovery process is highly dependent on the infrastructure we lay down. And that infrastructure is what creates, the bed for those kind of indirect damages we were talking about to really be laid upon. The better our infrastructure, the better our mental health in the future. It is unlikely that besides staving off death, that a large amount of clothing or water donations are going to massively improve mental health outcomes, whereas infrastructural changes do. And again, those are very different contexts, but we're talking about process here. One thing I recommend looking at is something called a logic model. I feel as though you are most likely very familiar with this, especially running large agencies. But many programs and small nonprofits, especially in the New Orleans area, don't have a complete logic model. A logic model is pretty much an awareness of what your identity is as an agency, the inputs to that agency that help you, meet those missions and goals and, uphold those values, and how they create those outputs, and then what the outcomes and impact are. And you always have a short-term, intermediate, long-term. This is heavily used in the monitoring and evaluation of agencies, and I can't do it justice in the time that we have. But if possible, looking into utilizing a tool like this is deeply effective for the disaster setting. Disaster managers love logic models. So if you can't create a disaster plan, the next thing you can do is revise your logic model to specifically suit disaster settings or post-disaster settings. So again, process, we're talking about the toolkit specifically presented by FEMA in this question. Process, not product, is the focus of this toolkit. It is going to heavily help you assess what your agency is capable of and what your recovery actions are. It'll identify areas of strength. It'll help you understand what models are we missing. You might realize that, oh my God, we don't have a logic model. It sounds silly, but these things actually create a great impetus for organization, especially if you have, shifting leaderships. If you, in disaster settings, you don't always know who's going to be available. So you need something to rely on that is consistent and validated. So I just included this to give you, this is from a disaster management textbook, but this is just kind of an example of, how we make these plans and how we suit a logic model specifically to disaster. So you might have an area in which you work, and then, how does it operate? What do you do? What are the ongoing activities within a specific area of your work or mission or agency? And then in a disaster, how does this look? How do we still manage this? So it's really great, again, to adapt your logic models with each outcome, each resource that you offer, each service, and say, well, how does this look in a disaster? It's actually kind of a fun activity. So these are also some, we were talking about like golden standards in the field. Don't overpromise in the recovery phase. This is often a huge issue with product. Many people will say, you know, we're going to have this happening, or with service, like a very definable service. Don't overpromise what you can do. I think that's obvious, but it's really easy to get caught up in the post-disaster fervor and want to solve as many problems as you can. It's very easy to want to mitigate human suffering, but you know, holding strong to those logic models and those processes is extremely important. It takes a lot of strength. Stay in constant contact. That really calls back to week one. Almost all of disaster management is about communication and process. So if you can remember those two things, you will be more prepared than many in a disaster setting. Honor your financial feasibility. There's not much more to say about that. It is really easy to overextend yourselves, or to extend one's staff, to extend your resources. And you really have to say, you know, is this the appropriate time in which we're going to respond? Can we afford this? I know so many well-meaning response teams, as well as small agencies that wanted to give survivors the world, and the money's just not there, and they're out of supplies in a day. It's really easy to kind of spend all your money and lose all your resources in a very, very condensed amount of time in this setting. And then again, think long-term. We've been talking about this for 4 weeks, and a lot of what we've been talking about is, you know, preserving resources, preserving energy, preserving time and finances. So, you know, it's kind of a long game. Disaster, it falls out of the minds of a lot of news and media rather quickly, considering the damage it does. And it's easy to kind of, you know, I think New Orleans is a special, unique city, and that is not necessarily true, that people understand it's a long process, but many agencies you interact with might not understand that. So always think long-term. And kind of the last final point is just kind of how can we gear this towards coalition building? Again, addressing blind spots. We talked a lot about what don't we know, what do we know, addressing blind spots and creating opportunities to assess your plans, assess your logic models. This is really useful to do in a public format with your stakeholders. Maybe you'll show them a specific area of service and you're like, okay, what do we know about the services we offer? What don't we know? What do we need to know that we don't know? This is a hard thing to talk about, but you need to do it with agencies and other communities, with other individuals, to help you kind of develop the knowledge base around recovery. And that's what informs your logic models. This is all like a very complicated sort of matrix, but it's a really great activity to do with partners, and to do within community settings. Communities really tend to like this because they know a lot of things that we don't know. And it really affects our logic models and how we're going to move forward. So, you know, what we need to remember is disaster recovery is a phase. We use the word normal again, but you know, you can decide how you feel about it, but it's a goal to restore normal community activities that were disrupted by disaster impacts through best practices and process, involving both activities that were planned before disaster impact and those that were improvised after disaster impact. And again, this can be anywhere, you know, if we're really lucky, from a couple weeks, this could be years, this could be decades. It is a long phase, and it rolls right into preparedness. So that concludes our 4-week exploration of disaster management. It was a lot of content, but I really appreciate you working with me to kind of synthesize this and how it works for people in practice. Does anyone have any questions? You can type it in before we conclude. I believe that's all of it for CLearn. Is that right, Ashley? This is it.
This is it. Yep.
Wow. All right. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, or if, Ashley, you have any closing thoughts or anything we need to know?
No, I just think, one, shout out to Habitat for making all the sessions. But no, it's been great. It's been a great 4 weeks, and I'm glad that, you know, we were able to have folks attend to each session, and that everything's been posted, and we haven't run into any drastic technology issues, and the content has been well received. We had quite a few folks respond to the evaluations, so the reviews have been good so far, which is fantastic. So yeah, I don't have much to add.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you to everyone who participated. It was really nice having you on. I really hope that this topic continues to be of interest to you in the future, and thank you for the work that you do.
All right, well, with that, we will conclude our TA session. So thanks again for joining. And of course, if you have any additional questions, Jen, do you want me to put your email address on the website with the webinar?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Cool. So I know that Lori also volunteered her email address. I'll check with Wayne and Gail, but if you have any information or questions that you come up with later, feel free to reach out to them. Their information has been posted on the website with the recordings, along with the PowerPoint information. So with that, I hope you guys have a fantastic Friday, and I'm sure you'll be hearing from me soon. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye, guys.